Welcome to episode 202 of the Lone Hockey Podcast, where we obviously got a little bit of a different look today here. And we're going to be doing a game preview of tonight's matchup between Minnesota and the Blackhawks. So, obviously, it was kind of disappointing the other night with how the game against Tampa went for Chicago. I felt like they played really well throughout most of the game. It just they kind of slipped up towards the end. And again, it's been a common theme. I remember discussing this in multiple episodes previously when talking about the Blackhawks, how they just they came close and then up until the very, very end, it's just they kind of let the game trickle away, which is unfortunate, but it's just kind of how it's gone. And there's many instances throughout the season where many games have gone that way. And with this matchup with Minnesota, obviously you're getting Jared Spurgeon back, you're getting Kirill Kaprizov back for Minnesota, and they need those two guys back. They've dealt with a lot of injury issues throughout the middle of the season thus far, and they've been looking to get those guys back. I feel like Matthew Boldy without Kaprizov, especially up front, Matthew Boldy took on a major role to fill in his shoes and to really try and make himself better. And I felt like over the course of the last few weeks with Kaprizov out, Boldy kind of rose to stardom a little bit more with Minnesota. And even some of their guys on the back end were instrumental in terms of the guys that they had to rely upon. And normally some guys who play up and down their top six inside their defensive core had to play in their top four and had to play a little bit more minutes, which is good for them and good reps for them. And then you just look at how the game went the other night too. I was really impressed with how you get a lot of these younger players who are scoring throughout the game. Like Frank Nazar scored. That was his first goal in, I believe, a few weeks, in almost 3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. Louis Crevier scored. Colton Dach scored his first career goal. Like so many guys who were instrumental in their own development in Rockford and played really well in Rockford for the time that they were there. They were so reliable there, and now they've come up and brought some offense and brought a lot of versatility in terms of what they can bring to the table. And those guys are really unique. And I felt like they were all playing really well. A lot of the younger guys last game for the Hawks were playing really well too. Like of course Connor Bedard, and then even Crevier and Vlasic. Like Crevier and Vlasic together, I feel like has been a good pairing in that sense because those are two guys who play a steady game. They play steady defensively. They can be reliable defensively. Vlasic's one of the league's more underrated defenders when it comes to even strength defense, entry denials, and also just being able to mitigate situations on line rush. And through the analytics and the eye test, even slightly underrated offensively. And I know he's not necessarily a high octane offensive style defenseman, but you see the transition ability, you see the in zone offensive ability. He's shown some ability this year to be a power play one quarterback. And there's a lot of versatility and nuance to his game there that allows him to be more of a threat in transition and in the O zone. He's got a really lanky frame, obviously, but he really leverages that to his advantage. And then Louis Crevier is just kind of a clone of Vlasic in a sense. I feel like with Crevier, he's not as transition oriented. He's more shutdown, even more of a shutdown style defenseman than Vlasic is already. But with Crevier, you're getting a guy who can box out guys really well. I haven't really looked into his analytics as much quite yet, and I don't really know what his numbers are. And plus, the sample size of his games are so small that's hard to really justify what he really could be. But with Crevier, you're really getting a guy who can shut plays down around the net. He's good defending in the interior. He's good defending in the corners. He's really noticeable when it comes to his stick range and how he's able to defend from range with his stick and just how he's able to pressure guys. I feel like he's good at containing guys, even for his height. And sometimes bigger players, their disadvantage is their height when it comes to trying to pivot and turn because against smaller, more nimble guys, they don't have as much agility. It takes longer for them to turn. Think of like a truck, for example, relative to a car. Think of how long it takes for a truck especially with a bed attached to it. It takes so long for it to turn versus a car, it's like a second or two and it turns, right? I feel like that's a similar situation where you look at like the bigger player and it takes longer for them to turn and pivot. And then the smaller player, they're just able to freely move about. They're able to turn and it's just like normal. It's like second nature for them. And so that's the interesting thing when studying Crevier so far is I've watched him in the corners and I've watched him defend one on one. And he's not bad one on one. And he's got a size advantage, obviously, him being 6'8". But sometimes he has a harder time defending the smaller guys because the smaller guys can do two things. They can slip underneath him and because they can lower their center of gravity and they can just pivot off him easily. So that's the thing I've studied with Crevier so far, and I feel like he's going to adapt over time a little bit better. Like him being in the NHL now as a seventh round pick is really impressive. And not many seventh round picks play. And for him being able to play is still impressive. I feel like that's a really good quality that he's brought already. Him being a seventh round pick, him being a more productive player over the course of the last two-ish years in Rockford, and him improving his defensive reliability, it not only in Rockford, but just in the pro style game has been instrumental for the Hawks. And then you look at some other guys like Ryan Donato is very effective, and Teuvo Teravainen was very effective. Tyler Bertuzzi was very effective. I thought Philip Kurashev, he didn't do anything last game, but he was noticeable with his speed and checking. And I thought a lot of their guys were just really noticeable and were just creating a lot. And that was really good to see out of them. And then we look at this team stats comparisons. You look at Chicago's power play, which is 23.5% compared to Minnesota's 19%. PK percentage, Chicago's actually had a really underrated PK. Minnesota the opposite, where Chicago's is 81.2%, Minnesota them being 70.2 percentage in terms of their penalty kill. And then face-off percentage, obviously this is going to lean more in favor of Minnesota here. They have more reliable centers when it comes to face-off ability, and Ryan Hartman's been good, but Joel Eriksson has been really good, and they get a lot of quality draws. And then you look at the goals for per games played, Chicago with 2.6, Minnesota with 2.9. I think the difference here is, especially with Kaprizov back now, these totals are going to go up a little bit more. And obviously, them playing a lot of games, that's going to largen the sample size. It's going to make the sample size larger. And so Minnesota's just very productive offensively. Like Marco Rossi's been going all year, not only in terms of goal scoring, but also playmaking. He's been right around a point per game player. And then, of course, we mentioned Matthew Boldy. There's Kirill Kaprizov. And there's many. Matt Zuccarello is a really underrated one who you don't normally hear as much about. I feel like he's been playing his best hockey in Minnesota. And sort of like the Joe Pavelski effect of sorts. Like he went to a different team and that being Dallas for Pavelski with Zuccarello's Minnesota, and he just became more productive and he just generated a lot more offense, was really noticeable in how he was creating it. And obviously him playing with Kaprizov in Minnesota has certainly helped that, but I feel like for Zuccarello individually, he's just gotten so much better this season. And in the seasons that he's played with Minnesota, it's hard to believe that he's already played 6 years in Minnesota because it doesn't really feel like it. And then you look at the goals against per game, and this is obviously one that is going to lean towards Minnesota here as well. Minnesota 2.88 and Chicago at 3.44. Chicago just gives up a lot of shots from the interior. Minnesota is kind of the opposite, where they have a lot of good defensemen when it comes to defending interior. Obviously, with them struggling with injuries in their defensive core, it's kind of made their totals a little bit different in terms of how they're giving up goals because you lose Brock Faber, you lose Jared Spurgeon, and you lose Jonas Brodin. Those are three tough guys to replace for any team inside their top four. And so even though Minnesota's been without those guys, they've done a good job adapting, I feel like, and they still have maintained some degree of consistency, which is a really good sign to see. So it'll be interesting to see how if they add these guys back and if they're able to consistently score a lot more goals again. But so Minnesota, it's they obviously have the upper hand tonight, but Chicago, if they can engage with their checking ability, their forechecking, and just getting a lot of scoring depth from up and down their top nine, I feel like they might be able to challenge Minnesota, especially with Kaprizov and Spurgeon back now.